crucially, neither Trump or Putin actually seem to have come to any conclusion on the back of these talks about what a settlement could look like, you know, what any of the details are, and indeed whether Putin's ready to commit to any sort of specific timeline. So I think Putin on purpose left that kind of wide open.
Emily Ferris, thank you so much for speaking to us. Did we learn anything new from the Trump-Putin phone call? Did it move the dial at all in terms of peace talks for Ukraine?
I don't think so substantively. It's one of those meetings, I think, that the significance is more in the fact that it happened at all. So, you know, this is the first meeting between Trump and Putin. It's a huge acknowledgement of Putin's international position. It's a good opportunity for him to get in front of one of the most powerful people in the world. So for Russia, it's a huge sort of prestigious event. In terms of whether they came to any dramatic conclusions, I don't think we can say that at this point.
Is there an element to which a phone call between two leaders is on a par with a meeting? It's interesting you discussed it there as a meeting. Is there an equivalence there, or are we trying to build up to this official sort of person-to-person meeting in person in a room together?
Well, I think if any of us have learned anything from the COVID pandemic, it's that the in-person interactions mean a whole lot more than if we kind of do things in an electronic way. So it's one thing to have a phone call, but what you miss is sort of the nuances and you know, a handshake and kind of the personal aspect of it. And that's why the in-person meetings are so important. You can really kind of convey your personality. You can, you know, give things a little bit more meaning. There's other things around the meetings, you know, whether you do sort of official dinners, whether you meet other aides, whether there's a sort of, I'm not suggesting this is going to happen, but, you know, family events as well, if you kind of bring spouses along. So there's a great deal of relationship building that goes into it, which you really don't get from a phone call, which is probably just more to the point. So, you know, they haven't talked about whether there'll be a face-to-face meeting. That feels like the logical next step in terms of where the relationship will go. But crucially, that kind of hasn't been outlined yet. You don't see from either side any statement saying, and the next stage is that we're going to be meeting in XYZ number of months. So that's not been concluded yet.
Well, let's touch on that. What do you think the likelihood is of a face-to-face meeting?
Oh, well, I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, just because they haven't said it, just because they haven't committed to it, it doesn't mean that they haven't, you know, thought about it. So what I think probably is happening is that they're trying to see how the meeting is going to land in both the States and in Russia. So to see whether people are kind of taking this positively. And so far, it seems to be, certainly from the Russian side, I suppose the absence of negativity is the best way of describing it. There doesn't seem to be an assessment either by the media or these sort of relatively famous now military bloggers or members of the Duma, of the Russian parliament. There doesn't seem to be an assessment that this was a failure. It doesn't seem to be framed in a way that's negative towards the Americans. If anything, I mean, you know, they can't sort of resist a jibe at the Ukrainians, but they've kind of framed it as Putin and Trump are the ones that are kind of getting together to sort out the war and to come to some conclusion, and Ukraine is rather sidelined. So that seems to be the conclusion so far from the Russian side.
Usually in bilateral discussions, there's a whole load of meetings and relationships that go on beneath the leader level to lay the groundwork for these leader-on-leader talks. Do leader-on-leader in-person talks usually move the dial in terms of international relations? And I suppose the second question to that is, are Trump and Putin different from the norm, given Donald Trump's personality and Vladimir Putin's power within his political system?
It's a good question whether they really move the dial on things. I think they kind of have to happen. I think these meetings have to happen as a precursor to the finer details. And I think that's really kind of, I think, Europe's concern, which is that Trump is going to kind of come in more broadly, have the kind of, I suppose, the glamour and the ability to say that he brokered the negotiations, and then really leave the nitty gritty up to the European Union and the coalition of the willing. And that is actually the hardest bit to figure out, because the devil really is in these details about what a settlement agreement could look like. And crucially, neither Trump or Putin actually seem to have come to any conclusion on the back of these talks about what a settlement could look like, you know, what any of the details are, and indeed whether Putin's ready to commit to any sort of specific timeline. So I think Putin on purpose left that kind of wide open. Now, look, your question about their personalities. I think the diplomatic rule book is sort of being thrown out a little bit here when it comes to Trump. Whether that's effective or not, I think history will tell us. When it comes to Putin, you know, perhaps it doesn't hurt to try something a little different. It can be, you know, the sort of the previous American administration's position not to negotiate with Russia, not to speak to them, and to kind of issue rather ultimatums and sort of punitive sanctions. Doesn't seem to have worked in the way that was intended. It doesn't seem to have backed Russia down from the war. It hasn't pushed them towards peace, and it hasn't made a sort of a safer security environment. So the idea of trying something new and engaging with Russia does have, you know, a place as a part of national security, unpalatable though it might be. But it is sort of a way of doing, you know, diplomacy is a really important part of how to engage with Russia.
It was interesting when it looked like Ukrainian-Russian talks in Istanbul last week were going to happen, but between lower level officials than Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, came out and said, well, actually, you're not going to get anything done without Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin getting in a room together. That seemed to sort of undermine the importance of any of those talks that happened. What do you think was the reason behind Rubio saying something like that and suggesting that actually you just need to get these two men together to crack out some sort of peace process?
Well, it certainly seems to be the Russian perspective, actually, that without Trump in the room, that the Russians and Ukrainians are unlikely to, or some sort of mediation, to come to some kind of conclusion together. And that's partly due to Putin's insistence on talking about things like what he calls the root causes of the war. Now, I mean, that can refer to lots of different things, but what I think he's talking about is Ukraine's closer security relationship with the West, with NATO, potential membership of the European Union, all of those things that kind of Russia felt was in their mind was a sort of legitimate enough security concern to prompt the war. Questions about Crimea, all of these things, I think it can refer to lots of different things. And the fact that Putin is kind of returning to those kind of old questions again makes it very difficult to see where there's any new ground for them to cover with the Ukrainians. And I think you'll notice what Putin's doing when it comes to Trump is they're talking not very much about Ukraine. They're talking rather about the bilateral relationship with the Americans, about how to restore intelligence, not quite sharing. I don't think they're there yet, but you know, at least the connection between their senior leadership. They're talking about meetings. They're talking about the potential for other sort of more lucrative economic deals. It's not so much about rehashing old ground. So I wonder if sort of it's much more palatable for the Russians to be seen as going forward and sort of moving towards a new phase of their relationship with the Americans, rather than sort of going back with the Ukrainians to talk about a war where their position hasn't really changed and they sort of don't seem to be very interested in a particular compromise.
Is what Donald Trump is offering going to entice Vladimir Putin?
It's kind of difficult to know where Moscow's red lines are and what is actually appealing to them. So it's not also really clear what's on the table. So things like American investment in Russia seems in principle like a very attractive option. But when you look at that from a practical perspective, just the very difficult business environment that there is in Russia, not least the fact that there's very few, you know, even American legal firms that are there to sort of protect businesses, the fact that since the war, a huge amount of Russian businesses have been nationalized and now sort of part of state structures. It's quite an unattractive business environment to operate in, full stop. So I'm highly skeptical of a lot of the conversations that are going on about American investment in Russia, whether that's even possible, and especially any investment that's geographically located near to the front line or any of the territory that's been fought over, not least because of the practicalities of trying to operate in an area that is mind that is full of unexploded ordnance. I mean, if you look at sort of previous conflicts, Bosnia, the years that it took to demine those regions and make them safe, even for local inhabitants, was significant. So the idea that suddenly there would be sort of an American business boom that would benefit Russia and America mutually, I find sort of highly doubtful.
And we've spoken about the practical aspects of what a deal or some sort of arrangement might bring Russia from the US. Does Putin want acceptance and even approval from the United States or not?
I think this is a long historical dance between the Americans and the Russians. I think the Russians and the Soviet Union at that time often sort of sought recognition from the Americans as one of the most powerful countries in the world, as being on a par. So Russia believes that because of its geography, its huge landmass, its hydrocarbons, its nuclear power, its military might, that it has some sort of Russian exceptionalism, and that it should have a seat at the table, it should have a role internationally, and that it sort of, I suppose, deserves to play perhaps a more interventionist role in other countries. We're talking about spheres of influence. I suppose we've kind of gone a bit beyond that now when it comes to countries like Belarus and Ukraine that Russia has kind of tried to subjugate. So Russia, I think, has always sought not necessarily the approval of the Americans, but I think the acknowledgement that Russia is a similarly great power in its own right. And so when you have a president like Trump who is interested in meeting Putin, in talking to him, hearing what the Russian perspective is, even if they don't perhaps agree with it, I think that is of quite significant value to the Kremlin. And it does sort of suggest that that the Americans believe Russia to be perhaps maybe not an equal player, but one at least that deserves to have a seat at the table. And I think that's a really long-standing historical relationship.
Emily, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Pleasure. Thank you.